In this segment, I'm going to introduce you to some SceneDesigner terminology while we take a tour around the tool. So this is what the tool looks like, SceneDesigner looks like when you launch it first. Each of these panels over here can be docked and rearranged, and these are called command panels in SceneDesigner parlance. And command panels are provided via plugins. All of the docking for these command panels is handled by SceneDesigner. So it's very similar to a Visual Studio style docking scheme where you have panels that can be auto hidden or docked. You can drag panels into tabs like here and move them around. And whatever configuration you come up with here is actually saved out automatically by the tool whenever it quits. So if you ever need to reset your windows to the default, you can do that by going to the View menu and coming down and saying Reset Window Layout. And this will say, it'll ask you if you want to reset the layout. If you say yes, then the next time you launch SceneDesigner, it will be back to the default window layout that the tool ships with. So if you ever get into a bad situation where you don't like your docking format and you want to go back, you can do that way. So I'm going to quickly run through each of these command panels and what they do. So first, let me go ahead and load up a scene so we have something to look at here. This panel's an important panel. This is the selection panel. So the current selection in the scene is controlled on this panel. So as I click in the scene and pick on items, let me make this bigger. I click in here and pick on items and select different things in the scene. The current selection is highlighted over here. I could also select all, select none, or invert selection with this panel as well. And as you just saw, I can multi-select as well, and that's how I can select multiple items in the scene. There's also a concept here called a selection set. In a later tutorial, we'll go into more about this. So the selection panel allows you to select items. This is the palettes panel in which you can drill through the various palettes that have been loaded. A palette is basically a collection of entity templates that can be instanced into the scene, and they can be categorized here as you can see, and then you can double click and instance these into the scene, which will be covered a little bit later as well. This is the entity properties panel, so for whichever entity is selected, you'll get a set of properties in here. The properties will list various information about the entity and are organized into components that can be collapsed. We'll go much more into detail about this in a later segment. This main panel, which is the only panel that can't be docked, is the viewports panel. And this contains either a single large viewport, or if you hit the toggle viewports button, for smaller viewports. Each viewport you can change the perspective and the camera and everything in it, as well as the rendering mode to change from wireframe to standard rendering. And we'll talk more about that in a later section. Over here on these panels, we have an undo panel which shows all of the events, all of the commands that you've done since starting the tool, and you can undo. And if you want to undo multiple commands, you can just click down there and it'll undo multiple ones. You can switch to redo and redo everything as well. And the undo stack is kept from the beginning of the application, and so you always can undo most things that you do in the tool. There's a viewport settings panel which really just shows, let me unhide this so it doesn't pop like this. There's a viewport settings panel where you can choose the viewport camera to use and the rendering mode to use in each viewport, the selected viewport, which is the one that's highlighted in yellow. All of these are available by right-clicking the name in the upper left of the viewport. You have access to all of that same information, but it's here for you as well if you prefer to use this. There's also a components panel. This lists all the components that the tool knows about and allows you to create new components. We'll go into that more later. And then there's a selection sets panel, which allows you to create and select sets of objects. We'll talk about that. Finally, there's a messages panel down here at the bottom, which prints out errors or other messages that may occur during the tool. So if you try to do something and apparently nothing happens or it doesn't do what you're expecting it to do, check the messages panel to make sure that no error messages have been spit out that tell you about what happened or what went wrong. There's a couple other panels here as well, two of which have to do with terrain. So this is the terrain panel. Let me pop this out so it's more easily visible. And this will be talked about in an entirely different tutorial set. And by the way, double-clicking on the title of a panel will pop it out, or as a floating panel, or put it back where it originally was. There's also a panel that has to do with terrain, which is a material palette panel. That's talked about in a different tutorial track as well. And the final one is a template properties panel, which is very similar to the entity properties panel, but gives you properties for the currently selected entity template. So I've talked about a few of these things when I was running through the panels. Let me define a little bit more what I'm talking about. So I mentioned that a palette is a collection of entities which exists in a file on disk in a particular directory, a palette directory. And you can drill through the categories and select palettes here. You can add palettes to it, add templates to the palette. You can create new palettes and delete them all in this palettes panel. An entity template is what's stored in a palette, and this, if you right-click and say properties, you can see the default properties that are on this template. And each template can be instanced into the scene to become an entity. So here I've selected an entity in the scene, and you can see that the entity properties panel then shows the properties for that instance of this of a particular template. If you ever want to know which template an entity comes from, you just go to the selection panel, right-click and say Show Template, and it'll select that template in the palettes view, as well as pop up the template properties for that, so that you can see what they are. Also, there is a property. Well, I didn't define property. Property is basically just a bunch of data that is sitting on an entity. And that data really could mean anything. And the properties are grouped into components. And a component is a set of properties and optionally some runtime behavior that gets executed. So for example, a light component, if I select a light here, contains a bunch of properties that define the characteristics of that particular light. That's it for this segment. In the next segment, we'll talk about some of the basics of navigating in the viewport.